Welcome to 60 Skills, and the topic of today's video is meditations upon the Sephirot. Alright, now the Sephirot are an inherent part of the Kabbalah as expressed by its more traditional Jewish interpretation. And it's important to consider that the egregoric associations with this are not small. That said, another way of looking at the Sephirot are either non-dual light or akashic emanations of non-dual light. Now, the reason why this is important is the experience of enlightenment is essentially a movement of your consciousness from a void or akasha state into this non-dual state. Energetically, physiologically, training-wise, this is a fairly large jump in terms of the movement of your perception. Now, because of this, most people will have these experiences as a result of the meditative process. What they will generally lack is the ability to do this at will. And this is simple. Things have to line up a certain way, you need a certain amount of energy, maybe there's some astrological influences, and occasionally when practicing, this will happen. However, to turn this into an ability where you can intentionally project yourself into this state reliably is quite another trick. In fact, this is so rare that in many systems, this is considered the ultimate form of enlightenment, really reserved for a chosen few. So if you are familiar with Theravada Buddhism from Southeast Asia, an individual who can do this is known as an arahant. Now, to give you an idea of how rare this is, out of every 100 or so Forest Wat tradition monks, maybe one might actually develop to this level. It is, in fact, fairly rare. Well, what is to be done about this? Okay, if there's a large jump required to go from this void or akashic state into this true, complete non-dual state, let's try cutting it up into smaller steps. This is where the Sephirot, in terms of its akashic emanation, or in the Franz Barden or Hermetic system that I practice, that ball above head level, becomes useful. Now, on paper, there are either 10 or 11 Sephirot, depending upon whether or not you count Dath as a Sephirot or not. Again, this is a subject of debate, but practically speaking, it is utilized this way in many different systems. Now, if you speak, can read, and write Hebrew, and you are part of the ultra-Orthodox community in Judaism, I'm sure there are a variety of resources available on this process. That said, these are largely not available to people outside that ethnocentric group. So, a project, 60 Skills, has been working on for the last couple of years involves stacking the elements, then the planets, then the zodiac, and finally the Sephirot. Now this is done with the Sephirot at the level of the akasha above the head, the zodiac at the level of the mental, involving the pineal gland and the mental body in the center of the head, either the heart center or the solar plexus at the planetary level, and the lower abdomen at the level of the elements and/or letters. I have progressively worked my way from the elements to the planets to the zodiac, and am now about halfway, a little bit more, through the Sephirot meditations. Now, what became aware to me at this point in time was that yes, my thoughts that breaking it up into smaller pieces are a way to pursue this. So, how would one go about doing this? Well, first you would start meditating upon Malkuth above your head. The zodiac association for this varies from individual to individual and is generally agreed to be the ascendant in your astrological chart. The planet utilized is, of course, Earth, and the element is, of course, Earth. Then you move on to the next, such as Yesod, Hod, Necha, Tipereth, Geburah, Chesed, Dath, Bina, Chogmah, and Kether, so on and so forth. This can be referred to as the path of enlightenment or the path of ascension because you're going from a more dense representation of reality to a more refined one. Again, if you're using the Akashic representations of the Sephirot, you're breaking that movement from its base level at Malkuth all the way up to Kether. Now, this makes sense from an engineering standpoint. And as many people who are familiar with this channel understand, this is a primary aspect of the work involved with this channel, to apply a technique and engineering-based approach towards the various esoteric phenomena. In other words, if you do A, you get B. Now, based upon your genetics, health, astrological correspondences, etc., someone's strength at something may vary, and someone's developmental timeline between individuals can very well may vary. That said, if you have the ability to do the work at all, I haven't seen this approach fail anyone yet, assuming they were willing to give it the adequate level of effort. Okay, so this makes sense. If we want to go up that path of enlightenment from the void state into true Kether or true non-dual light, let's break it up into smaller steps. So first we go from Malkuth, then we go to Yesod. Here is something that is left out in a lot of these descriptions that became clear to me. As you were going up this path of reality, from the more gross or more solid or more physical to the more refined or ethereal, this can be pursued through a process of releasing. So if you view the body as having multiple subtle bodies, from that vital or material body to the astral body represented by the planets, to the mental body represented by the zodiac, and finally to the Akashic body related to the Sephirot, it's easy to see how there might be, in effect, if not fact, more than one subtle body in these different categories. For example, one of my teachers, Mark Rasmus, has mentioned that there are hundreds of different kinds of astral clairvoyance because there are hundreds of different kinds of astral energies. Could these also be interpreted as different subtle bodies? I think it's not a big stretch to say yes to that question. So, what are we going to do? All right, when you're working at that Akashic level, you view that Malkuth body as a subtle body, and then you view Yesod as a subtle body associated with you. Now here's the interesting part. The releasing doesn't really take place with the body itself, because you can't really get rid of one of your subtle bodies. What you can do is release the connection between two different subtle bodies. So one way of doing this would be going into that space between your Malkuth and your Yesod body. Then going in there, generating Malkuth energy, that yellow earthy energy, and clearing out that space. This will loosen the connection between that Malkuth and Yesod body. But then you have to take your Yesod energy, which is in turn a air and moon influenced indigo colored energy, and then you release that as well. This in turn clears out that connection between Malkuth and Yesod in terms of your body and allows you to ascend further up that chain of reality. So once you get to Yesod and you want to release between Yesod or transfer your consciousness from Yesod to Hod, then you go into that space between Yesod and Hod. You generate that Yesod energy to clear the space and loosen things up. Then you generate in that same space the Hod energy to release things and clear things up. And then you pop right up into that Hod state. And you continue to do this all the way up to Kether, at which point you encounter non-dual light in its pure form, the nirvana of Buddhist, the God of the monotheistic faiths, the true Tao, so on and so on and so on. Okay, How do you know if you've actually projected into pure non-dual light? Well, it's actually rather easy to understand. It can only be defined in the negative. So when you go through the writings and teachings of the ancient sages, what you'll see is they'll talk about all the different defining characteristics between the material world and Akasha or the void state. Even the void has definable characteristics. What does not have definable characteristics is that non-dual light state. It can only be defined in the negative. It's not this, it's not that. And that ultimately is how you know you've experienced it. Now, as a conscious factor, it's very difficult to bring much back from that non-dual state. Whatever happens there seems to be terribly important, but what it exactly is, well, again, we can only define in the negative. However, there are a few tricks. One of which is when you project your consciousness into that non-dual state, you attempt to maintain your consciousness as a kind of sphere. And this makes sense because once you get to the mental, in theory anyway, there's no conscious construct involving spatial limitation, which is a fancy way of stating you can't see something as a clearly defined form because it doesn't have any edges or anything containing it. A sphere, in terms of your consciousness, is probably the closest thing you can get to holding this. Now, both myself and other people that I've talked to who have projected into that non-dual state have confirmed that if you do it with the intention of maintaining your consciousness as a sphere, you can end up bringing back a little more information. And again, keep in mind, this is by degree. You're not going to go there and have a scene play out and remember everything concretely, but you'll be able to bring back more consciously than you could otherwise. Now, keep in mind the tendency of our to forget different meditative phenomenon as we go on and time passes makes it very important to write everything down as quickly as you can in your journal. So, if you found today's topic of conversation interesting, please give us a like, leave a comment, and hit the subscribe button. Otherwise, as per usual, you can go to SixtySkills.com or Perseus Arcane Academy to learn more about what we're doing. Otherwise, as per usual, train hard and be well.